Well, hello again, and welcome to this second day for the workshop in scientific writing and publishing, which is specifically for Indonesian researchers into disaster risk and related subjects. It's great to have many of you back again for day two. I think a few more will be joining us in the coming minutes. So what I want to do is just quickly run through the program for the second day, just to give you a feeling of what we've got coming up. So we're going to start off with a talk by Gemma from Emerald Publishing. I'm delighted that she's joining us to offer a publisher perspective on the kind of the publication process. We've heard more from editors and reviewers and authors, but it'll be very good to hear from a publisher perspective. I'm then going to talk a little bit about publication ethics, which I think has become a very significant issue, quite a prominent issue in recent years. We'll then take a screen break, and it's a chance for a prayer break as well, at about 3:15 in Indonesian time. And then afterwards, we'll have an expert panel discussion on the peer review process. So I'm delighted we have people from Japan, from Indonesia, from Australia, and also the UK, who can offer very much a kind of global perspective, but also from different parts of the publication process. So we have people who are very experienced authors, but also people who've been involved in editing books or journals, people who've done a lot of peer review, and also some people who've processed papers behind the scenes, so to explain how the peer review process takes place from a journal perspective. So we're going to look at a lot of different issues during that process. And it'll be a chance for you to also ask questions of quite experienced researchers. We'll then move on to a briefing on the one-to-one publication surgery that we have planned in the coming weeks, and I'll explain how that will work. And then we'll finish with acknowledgements and close. So we'll hope to finish by about 5:15 in Indonesian time. Now, just to let you know, we've tried to build a little bit more time in today for some questions. So particularly if any of the speakers prompt your questions, please do put them in the chat box as with yesterday, and we'll try and pose them to the panelists and speakers, because obviously that's an important part of the process as well. Okay, so that's an overview of the day's agenda. But just to kick things off with, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Gemma, who's the journal's commissioning lead at Emerald Publishing. Now, I must say my journey with Emerald goes back to even when I was an undergraduate, doing my undergraduate dissertation. I remember citing various Emerald journals back in the mid to late 90s, and then I used them extensively during my PhD as well. And then as I became a bit more experienced, I was able to start publishing as well in some Emerald journals. And then back in 2009, I think it was, we proposed to set up a journal on disaster resilience in the built environment. And because we recognized Emerald as a kind of leading publisher, we decided to propose the idea to them, and went through the process, and we were delighted to be able to launch a journal with such a recognized publisher. So we very much enjoyed working with Emerald, and I'm delighted that we can now get the experience really from a publisher perspective. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Emerald Publishing and the types of journals that you offer, but also maybe some of the different models of publishing. So open access has obviously become quite a big area of publishing in the last 10 years or so, and I know Emerald have made some moves in that regard. But also in terms of maybe if you can, any guidance you've got from selecting the right journal, maybe whether metrics need to be considered, what makes a good article, because I know you have a lot of experience from across a wide range of fields and different journals, so not just disaster risk. So it'd be great to hear from you. So please, Gemma, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see that. Can you see?
Yes, we can see that. That's great.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks again for inviting me today. Hope everyone is well and enjoying the webinar, sorry, the workshop. So my name is Gemma Hemming and I'm a journals commissioning lead at Emerald Publishing, and I work in the fields of property management and the built environment, and also environmental management. And I've worked in academic publishing for over 10 years, and I've been at Emerald for 4 years now. So as Richard said, I'm going to give a publisher's perspective on the publishing process. So I'll start with a brief introduction to Emerald, our journals, and also our publication options, including open access. And I'll also give some hints and tips on how to get published in an academic journal. And I'll be happy to answer questions at the end, so please do type in the chat box. So for those who aren't familiar with Emerald, we were founded in 1967 by a group of academics at the University of Bradford School of Management. Our head office is in the UK, in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and we've got offices worldwide. We're an independent family-owned publisher, and we currently publish over 300 journals, have a book front list of over 200, and also we publish a growing number of teaching cases. And our core subjects are in business, management, education, engineering, and the built environment. So Emerald supports the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and as part of this, we publish, promote, and disseminate research on 4 interdisciplinary goals. And these goals are fairer society, healthier lives, responsible management, and quality education for all. And each of our 4 goals relate to several corresponding SDGs. So what do we publish in the field of disaster risk? Well, we have 2 flagship journals. One is the International Journal of Disaster Resilience in the Built Environment, which is edited by Professor Richard Haigh and Professor Delanthe Amaratunga. And that's a Scopus indexed journal. And we also have Disaster Prevention and Management, which again is indexed in Scopus. And we also publish related content in a number of other journals, including the International Journal of Emergency Services, Built Environment Project and Asset Management, and in our fully open access journal, International Journal of Climate Change Strategies and Management. So as well as books, as well as journals, we also publish books, and we offer flexible book formats. For example, research monographs, edited collections, short form books, professional and also trade-oriented titles. So moving on to open access. So we provide a broad range of open access publishing models across our journals and books. And we also have a dedicated open access platform called Emerald Open Research. So our green OA route allows all Emerald journal or book chapter authors to have the option of making their research available openly and immediately on publication, free from payment. So for example, you are able to deposit the author accepted version of your manuscript in your institutional repository. Authors can also publish gold open access in any of our journals through either the hybrid option or in one of our fully gold OA journals. It's just important to note that an article processing charge, or APC, is payable on acceptance. We have an APC voucher scheme with a number of partner institutions, so you may be eligible for one of these. So please do check the website or get in touch with me. And then under our Emerald Publishing Services programme, we publish a growing number of platinum open access journals. whereby the costs of publishing an OA journal are sponsored by a third party, such as an institution or an association. And all the articles published in that journal are automatically published as open access with no cost to the author. The publication fees are met by the sponsoring institution or organisation. So our latest open access offering is Emerald Open Research, which is a new and pioneering open access platform that supports rapid publication of a range of research outputs. It was launched a couple of years ago in partnership with F1000 Research. So it's an online platform. It isn't a traditional journal, so there's no editor. It's completely open access. So all the research is freely available to read, download and reuse. So the content reaches a truly global audience. And interestingly, the peer review of articles takes place after publication. So unlike the traditional double-blind peer-reviewed journals, the peer review takes place after the article appears online, and expert reviewers are invited after that. And the peer review process is entirely open and transparent. Each peer review report is published on the platform with the reviewer's name and affiliation alongside the article. And the platform also benefits from an open data policy, which supports Emerald's commitment to open research. So the platform consists of 6 gateways, which are each aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they're very broad and interdisciplinary. And the 6 gateways are fairer society, healthier lives, quality education for all, sustainable food systems, responsible management, and sustainable cities. And the platform publishes content beyond traditional research articles, such as policy briefs, opinion articles, posters and slides, and data notes. So I look after the Sustainable Cities Gateway, and this focuses on how we can create resilient, sustainable, and inclusive cities for all. And it also covers disaster resilience as well. So I do recommend taking a look at that, because all the content is free to read. So now I'll turn specifically to journal publishing with some tips on how to get published. How to select the right journal. Well, choosing a journal to publish in is an investment decision, and a good choice can enhance the impact of your work and also your reputation. So some of the factors to consider are the readership. So think about who you want to target. Is the audience the right one for your work? So you can look at recent articles in the journal. Do they cover topics similar to yours? And also look at papers that you've cited and where they were published. And other things to think about are the internationality and circulation of the journal, and also the chances of acceptance and the publication time as well. So the time from submission to publication. And it's also important to consider the type of paper you're planning to write. For example, is it a practice paper, a research paper, a case study, a review, or a viewpoint? So check which types of paper the journal accepts before you submit. And this will be listed on the journal website. And if there is any doubt, it's recommended to contact the editor as well, because they'd be happy to help, as would the publisher. And if you have an open access mandate, you can publish OA with any Emerald journal, and the usual peer review process applies. You would just need to mention that you'd like to choose the OA option when you submit. Other things to consider are the usage of the journal, how well used and read is it, and also the perception of your peers. It's helpful to ask colleagues for journal recommendations. Another factor to consider is co-authorship. It's often a good opportunity for first-time authors, as it can add value and weight to the paper. And then quality is another key factor to take into account. So are citations and rankings important to you? So Scopus and Web of Science are the most well-known ranking systems, but others do exist. And citations are a good, but not necessarily a complete guide to quality. So other factors should be considered, such as the usage, the impact, and the reputation of the journal. And Emerald is a signatory of DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. And a key part of DORA is that journal-based metrics are often misused and ill-applied in research and researcher evaluation. So signing up to DORA is a natural extension of Emerald's commitment to driving positive change excuse me, and working in partnership with communities across and beyond the research ecosystem. So what makes a good paper? So is it original? What's new about the argument or the results? So make this clear to the reader. And highlight the relevance to an extension of existing knowledge in your field. Ensure that you have a robust research methodology. Are your conclusions valid and objective? And is it well written? Clarity, structure, and quality of the writing are crucial. Make sure you have a sound, logical progression of your argument, and highlight the theoretical and practical implications, the so what factors. Also key to include recent and relevant references, and also think about the internationality and global focus. And it's key to adhere to the editorial scope and objectives of the journal. So make sure that the content of your article does match the aims and scope. And also make sure that you have a good title and keywords, as well as a well-written abstract, as this will help with discoverability. And finally, it's crucial to follow the referencing and house style of the journal, and also adhere to the word length. And that information will be provided on the journal homepage in the instructions for authors. So now moving on to polishing your work. So when proofreading, we would recommend that you look for things such as incorrect grammar, spelling and punctuation, and make sure that there aren't any flow or transition or sense problems, and that there aren't any unintended typographical errors. And check that any mathematical or statistical content is accurate, that all of the references are complete and correct as well, and also ensure consistency throughout your paper. And we would recommend that you use, but don't overly rely on the spell checker, as it's not always 100% accurate. And it's also advisable to show the draft to someone else. So to one of your colleagues, it's important to have a fresh pair of eyes look at it. And if English isn't your first language, you could consider using a language editing service. There are a range of paid services available. For example, at Emerald, we partner with a service called Editage, and they match you with a relevant expert who will provide language support and also translation and editing. So now moving on to the peer review process. So you would submit the paper via the ScholarOne manuscript site, and it then is checked initially by the editor, which is known as a desk review phase. So the editor will check that the paper is in scope and that the submission criteria have been met, that all the author's information is there, their institution, their email address, and so on. So that usually takes around 2 weeks. And then if the editor believes that the paper is in scope and that all the criteria have been met, it will then be sent to independent reviewers for review. And usually our journals send it to 2 double-blind peer reviewers. And this can take around a week or 2 to invite the reviewers. It can take longer depending on how busy the reviewers are or if they're unable to review the paper. So sometimes editors have to send the article to, well, potentially more than 4 or 5 people. It can be up to 10 in some cases, depending on how busy they are. So the reviewers would take around 6 to 8 weeks to review the paper, and they provide feedback to the editor. And then the editor would make a decision based on the feedback from the reviewers. So that could either be accept, reject, or revise as well. So in total, the ideal time from submission to receiving feedback is 3 to 4 months, but it may be longer. And this depends on a number of factors, such as the number of papers in the queue for initial assessment, and also the availability of reviewers and the reviewer response time. And we are finding that the pandemic has impacted turnaround times, so that's just something to bear in mind. So if you receive a request for revision, that is good news. You're now in the publishing cycle, and nearly every published paper is revised at least once. And even if the comments appear to be sharp or discouraging, please do remember that they aren't personal. So we would recommend that you acknowledge and thank the editor for the comments. If you do disagree with any of the comments, we would suggest that you explain why to the editor. And if there isn't anything that you understand, it's best to clarify and double check if you're in doubt. And also it's important to check with your co-authors as well, or if it's a single authored paper, then check with any colleagues. And it's crucial to try and meet the revision deadline that you're given, or if you're unable to do so, please do ask for an extension. And then finally, we would suggest that you attach a cover letter, which identifies point by point how the revision requests have been met. And if you haven't met them, explain why. And then if your paper is rejected, this could be for a number of reasons, such as not following the instructions or the author guidelines, that it's inappropriate to the journal scope, that there are problems with quality, so inappropriate methodology perhaps, or it isn't reasonably rigorous, that the motivation for the paper is weak, that it makes insufficient contribution to the field. But please do remember, don't give up, ask and listen and try to improve and then resubmit when you're ready. So if it's accepted, it's then over to us at the publishers. So we will conduct editorial rights and permission checks, and we will ensure that the copyright form is signed by the authors. We then pass the paper to the typesetters and they produce author proofs, which are sent to the authors for checking. And when all the corrections have been made, we will then pass the paper to the production team and they will tag your work to ensure that it's searchable and discoverable. And an online early version will be published ahead of official publication on Early Site. And this version receives a digital object identifier, or DOI, so your paper can be cited straight away. And we also index your work with providers such as Web of Science, Scopus, ProQuest and EBSCO. And we also help to disseminate and promote your work through marketing campaigns. And we also invest in technology that makes your research easier to find and read on our platform. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all for listening. And if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. That was excellent. So yeah, as Gemma said, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and we can go through those. I've got one or two questions that are coming through. I think a lot of people are intrigued by the open access options that you mentioned. So I suppose the first question I think that's often asked is, what are the typical costs associated with making an article gold open access rather than green? Is that standard across the journals, or is there some variation?
Yes, it is standard across all of our journals. So every journal does have the open access option, which we call the hybrid option. And the current article processing charge is £2,495, or in US dollars, that's $3,370.
Okay.
So that is standard across all the journals, and that includes our fully gold open access journals as well.
What do you actually get? So are you then allowed to share the final copy freely?
Yes.
So if you want to use ResearchGate or your kind of institutional repositories, you can use that final version. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And also with our green option, the author accepted version of the manuscript. So not the publisher PDF typeset version, but the version that's accepted for publication. So the Word version that's before it's had the formatting by the publisher. Under our green OA policy, that version can be shared as well on acceptance. So that version can be put in your institutional repository if you wish to do so. And we're one of the few publishers that don't have any embargo period on that as well. Okay.
Well, that's very useful. I think a lot of people don't understand actually that ability to share their material in that sort of pre-publication, the final accepted manuscript version.
Yes,
so it's also useful. And just in terms of when you have to make a decision on open access, because I know clearly it requires some investment, often from an institution or from a funding body. What's the kind of the stage in the publication process that you can decide to move to an open access position? Is it fixed?
Ideally, it should be when you submit the paper. So when an author submits via Scholar One, there are a series of questions that they answer, and one of them includes open access. So there's a tick box, either yes or no, and at that stage we would hopefully be alerted to the choice of the author if they did want to publish open access. But if it is a bit later on, because I appreciate that funding can maybe be achieved later on, so if it isn't too late in the process, we should be able to make it open access before publication. So once it's in the system, we should be able to make that, but if in doubt, it's worth checking with the publisher. And we also do have a retrospective OA policy, excuse me. So if you find out that you do get some funding after the article has been published, we can apply to make it OA. And I think there's a time lag of around 6 months after publication. So that's, something to note as well.
Okay, no, that's very useful as well. Okay, so another question in terms of, you mentioned the international focus of a lot of Emerald's publications, and I suppose Emerald more broadly. What if the paper is a case study on a specific country? So maybe it seems to have quite a tight, narrow focus, maybe on an individual city or country. Can it be considered to be published in that very wider international context?
I think it would depend on the editor and the reviewers, and down to the individual policy of the journal as well. But we have published papers like that. We would just recommend that the international context is referenced in the article as well. So we have published case studies on specific countries or cities or regions, So yeah, it's something that we would be willing to publish, and provided that it all goes through the peer review process and that the editor's on board with it.
Yeah, I think from an editor perspective, that's what we would look for, is to make sure that if it is a very focused study on a city or a country, it at least shows how, in terms of the state of the art, how that relates to a wider international practice. Is this country using the state of the art? Is it still using techniques and approaches that are maybe behind the state of the art, and there's a need to kind of relook at that situation. So that's good. Okay. Another, I think, common question: when a paper is rejected to a journal for some reason, can they rewrite and modify it and either resubmit to the same journal, or would they be able to resubmit it to another journal?
Yeah, that would be absolutely fine. So the key thing is that you don't submit it simultaneously to more than one journal. But if you do resubmit to the same journal, it would be worth making a note, letting the editor know that it's that you previously submitted it, so that they're aware and they don't treat it as a new submission, because they may send it to the same reviewers who reviewed initially, or they may decide to send it to completely new reviewers. But yeah, that's fine. And then if you wanted to submit it to another journal, that would be fine as well. Okay.
Yeah. And there's another question: is it possible for a literature review paper to be published in your journal? And if that is possible, what are the requirements? So is there a certain level of rigor required, I suppose, in terms of the literature review process? What are the typical expectations from editors?
Well, we do publish literature reviews. We don't have a huge amount, I must say. I don't know, Richard, if you've come across many in your journal.
I think what we're seeing is that I think now we would expect it to be either quite systematic, so really there's quite a robust methodology used to actually conduct the literature review, or that it really must be very analytical in nature and provide a new angle, new critique on the existing body of literature. So we would put quite a high threshold then on the discussion and analysis, so that it's moving the field along with a different perspective, rather than just I think it's often tempting for maybe PhD students who are doing that initial scan of the literature. Of course, it's very important for them to do that for their doctoral work, but it doesn't necessarily make a valid journal paper. Maybe it'd be more suited to a conference or similar.
Yes.
Okay, another one in terms of the timeliness, I suppose, of the work. So is it okay to publish a study that was maybe carried out 5 years ago? Is there a time period where we'd say that study is no longer appropriate for publication?
Again, I guess it would depend on the editor and the peer reviewers. So if there's a valid reason why, if that research is still valid, then I can't see a huge problem with that, as long as it was current still, I guess it still applied in today, or there was some new aspect. So I think the originality aspect is key, and if it adds something to the field of study as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've actually been asked this by authors quite recently, is, we did a study several years ago, are we still able to submit it? And I think that linked the literature to show that it's still timely, still has relevance, is important. Also some explanation of why it's taken so long to get to the publication process would be useful. But we wouldn't discount it, as long as they can show that the study still has some relevance, then we would consider it. Yeah. Okay, so maybe I think one final question. In terms of the time, so I think you gave an indication on your flowchart in terms of the typical time frames. What's the earliest you could expect a review, a response from a journal in terms of? Are there any records in that regard that you've heard?
Oh gosh, not off the top of my head. Although I would say I would be a bit wary if we did have very quick turnaround times. So it's, yeah, although speed is helpful in some respects, I think the rigor of the peer review process shouldn't be rushed at all. Although on the Emerald Open Research platform, because the peer review is done after the article is online, we can publish papers within a matter of weeks, because we don't have to wait for the reviewers. The review process is done post publication. So that is very quick. That's
a consideration if you're looking to get something out in the public.
Very quickly, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, well, you've plenty of questions. It's posed a lot of discussion. So, but I think that brings us to the end of our allocated time. So thank you very much, Gemma. That's been really insightful in terms of the publication process. I think we'll probably pick up a few of those issues with our panelists later as well.
Yes.
Again, we've got other editors and sort of experienced researchers, so that's been very useful. Okay.
Thank you for inviting me. And if anyone does have any questions, my email address was on the slide, so I'm happy to receive emails and look forward to hearing from you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.
Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Okay, so thank you very much to Gemma, and I think, as was shown by the number of questions that were posed, it prompted a lot of discussion. So we're now going to move on to a slightly different issue, but I think one that's quite topical at the moment, and that's with regards to publication ethics. So before we have a screen break, I'm going to look at the issue of so I suppose some of the ethical considerations that you need to think about right the way through the publication process. Now, I'm going to draw upon experience, both as my kind of some management experience, particularly at my last institution. I was involved as kind of in terms of managing research at a kind of school level, and some postgraduate research and postgraduate research training at the school level. I've also been a member of various university research and ethics committees that have seen various cases. And of course, I've had a lot of experience as from the other side, from as an author and as managing large grants. And also as a journal editor, and as in terms of editing conference proceedings and so forth. So I've seen the publication process from a lot of different perspectives. So I'll just try and share, I think, some of the issues that you should think about in the publication process. Now, I think periodically there'll be you'll probably see in the news a scandal about scientific fraud, and there was a very well-known case back, I think it was in about 2013, where in Japan, it was a Japanese author, actually, an expert in post-operative nausea and vomiting, and there'd been concerns raised about his work as far back as 2000, but it took over a decade for anything really to be done about it. And what ended up happening is that 172 of his published studies were retracted because they were found to be using false data. So they were based on false data. And of course, this type of academic misconduct really does have the potential to damage the reputation of science more broadly, and it is a very serious issue. And of course, we've also seen in recent years a proliferation of fake journals appearing. I'm sure many of you will have been approached by journals that really don't operate peer review processes, will make claims about indexing services that they're not actually valid. So there are various considerations around that. There's also, concerns in terms of the ethics of the research process itself, in terms of falsification of data or evidence, just suppression of data. So you may, find that you've actually found certain findings, you've uncovered certain issues that don't really fit in with the narrative that you would like to portray in your article, so you just ignore that in your work, and that will be maybe another way of misrepresenting your findings. And of course, a big issue around plagiarism and the deliberate misappropriation of the research work of others, typically not acknowledging the sources of other people's work. But it can also be, for example, that you choose to give a misleading account of what other authors have said. So you simplify their argument so that some of the context is lost, or you ignore some other statements they've made about the same issue, but because it doesn't, again, fit into your kind of neat narrative that you want to portray. So scientific fraud is a major concern, and if you look in the popular press now, there's a lot of articles expressing concern about the amount of scientific fraud. And of course, some of the drivers behind this are that people are being pressurized to publish. A lot of people get told they need to publish for career reasons, for promotion, so that there's a reason why a lot of academics feel that the need to perhaps misrepresent the work that they're doing in terms of trying to increase their ability to publish. So I want to just explore a little bit about why that's important and some of the specific concerns you might want to think about, because some of them aren't as obvious as others, but how some of the issues you might want to consider as you go through the publication process. Now, why is this particularly important? Well, I think it's very significant that publishing shows the development of knowledge in a field of study. And you may not think about this when you're writing an article, but when you think about how citations work, this is actually a diagram from the Thomson Reuters, as it was at the time when they published this, from the ISI Web of Knowledge, and it was trying to show how, if you imagine that your article is this pink box in the middle, that's your paper, and that's then you're citing perhaps 20, 25 other articles, and you are relying on what you're citing to be valid, so that they are robust conclusions that these authors have come to, and you're basing your work on that previous body of knowledge. And likewise, once your work goes into the public domain, it's gone through peer review, it's been published, it then forms that big body of knowledge. And in the future, these boxes represent the people who are citing your work. And if you think about that, that's how knowledge is developed. So we tend to look at the origins of particular concepts and our understanding of them, and over time they build up. So you could it's not always as nice and linear as this, but you might be drawing upon concepts from all sorts of different fields, and then all sorts of different fields may also draw upon your work in the future. And the danger is that if we allow academic fraud to take place, then of course it is corrupting that body of knowledge, because we're all making assumptions that the work that's been done previously is being reported in an appropriate manner, and that there isn't the deliberate falsification or misstatement or alteration of evidence or data. There isn't the deliberate suppression of relevant evidence or data. And there isn't the deliberate misappropriation of research work and data of others. So it is very important that we consider these issues of publication ethics, because we are contributing to that body of knowledge and we need to protect it. Now, I think we've seen actually in the last 18 months why this is so important, because if we take something like the vaccination program that we're all aware of, that's taking place with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it seems pretty clear that that vaccination program is fundamental to us being able to move to a new normal way of life. And trust in scientists and the vaccinations that have been developed is critical. And if people don't trust scientists, if they're concerned that the vaccines haven't been trialed properly, that results have been presented in a misleading way, then of course people will be reluctant to take the vaccine, and that could fundamentally undermine our ability to get out of this pandemic situation. And so trust in science is fundamental. And actually, when you look at vaccination rates around the world, countries with a high level of trust in science tend to have a much higher vaccination rate, not just for COVID-19, but for other vaccines as well. So it's very important that we don't undermine that trust in science through academic fraud. Because we all get tarnished with that. And I think in most countries, scientists have a good reputation. And certainly if I look at the UK context, scientists have a much better reputation than politicians or even religious leaders or teachers, school teachers, business. So scientists sit right at the top in terms of trust levels. So it's very important that we protect that position, and we all have a responsibility in achieving that. Now, what are some of the things that you might want to think about in the publication process that, in particular, in terms of publication ethics? Well, actually, you could go and have a look at a website. I've put it on here called publicationethics.org, and this was actually developed initially in the late 1990s, and it was a rather informal gathering of concerned editors, I think generally in the medical field, who got together because they were concerned that there was a degree of research misconduct and academic misconduct that was creeping into publications, and it was potentially damaging the credibility of science. And it now, COPE was actually formalized into a charity in 2008, and now many of the major publishers and journals, and I know, for example, Emerald and our own journal, sign up to the core principles that CORE have established in terms of publication ethics. So they've put certain expectations on publishers and journals to make sure that they have robust protocols for handling ethical considerations. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the details of that kind of code of conduct, but it does give you an idea of the types of issues that need to be considered. Now, I want to just talk, I'm going to pick out a few areas that I think are particularly timely at the moment, and maybe things you may want to be aware of. So some ethical considerations in publications. Briefly talk about predatory and vanity publishing, the issue of authorship and contribution, disclosure and conflict of interest, self-plagiarism. I'm not going to get too much into plagiarism, but I want to talk about self-plagiarism, which is often ignored or overlooked, and just issues around broader ethical oversight. And we actually touched on some of those issues yesterday, but I'll kind of reaffirm those. Now, many of you will be aware of there's different terminology, but some people call it predatory journals or predatory publishing, fake journals, or vanity publishing, often the terminology used. And I think many of you will have received emails from journals aggressively trying to encourage you to publish your work with them. And these journals are often set up by publishers who aren't widely recognized, and they will charge a fee for publishing. Now, this model of publishing, this open access journal publishing, which operates on an author pays business model, and we heard from Emerald that they also offer open access journals, as do most of the major publishers now. So if we look at Springer or Elsevier, they all have open access publication models, and these have developed over the last 10 years or so quite aggressively. And that's whereby the author pays a fee to have the research published online. So we've seen hundreds of new open access journals being set up by quite reputable publishers. And while it's easy to be critical of open access, one of the things we need to bear in mind is that actually the old publishing model often made it more difficult for scientists and researchers in developing countries, for example, to access the state of the art, because journals were very expensive to subscribe to, and a lot of universities couldn't afford to subscribe to some of the journals. So it made it very difficult for maybe people who were studying in universities that didn't have a lot of resources. They wouldn't have access to that state-of-the-art body of knowledge. So open access to some degree has opened out a lot of material to a much wider audience. It has, on the other hand, perhaps made it more difficult for some people to actually access those publishing routes because they are quite expensive. But also, another side effect of this publication model is that it's made it very difficult to identify less respectable predatory journals that are abusing this author pay model and are risking the integrity of published research. Now, some of you may have heard of the Beals list. Now, this was kept up to date until about 2017. I think now it's become it's fallen by the wayside a little bit. As I think to a large degree they've struggled to keep up with the number of journals that have been launched and that maybe have a dubious publishing context. But you can have a look at this list to see the vast number of less reputable journals that have been launched, these predatory journals. And so if you give you an idea of the type of journals that exist. Now, I won't go through all of the details, but I think there are various characteristics of these journals that tend to give you a strong indication that they are a predatory journal and are not reputable. A few of these, so firstly, they tend to use general phishing emails inviting submissions. So they can often be very complimentary about your previous work. They'll often look for conference papers that you might have published and say how fantastic your work is and that they want to publish it. And they're encouraging you to submit that work to the journal. The journals often have very wide scope, so linking unrelated fields or disciplines. So that the Journal of International Multidisciplinary Sciences, or that they'll link different fields that don't have a clear, obvious connection. And that can be difficult because, of course, interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity are encouraged, but generally they have a very broad scope to attract as many articles as possible. So be skeptical if they seem to be from a very broad range of sciences and don't have a clear focus. They often charge authors a fee up front before an article has been through peer review. And I think that's very different from the type of model that Emerald were talking about a moment ago. Gemma mentioned that they'll only charge once the article's been accepted. In contrast, a lot of these predatory journals will expect you to pay the fee before it even goes through the peer review process, because they rely on that income, and that in itself shows that they just want to get it through the peer review process as quickly as possible. Gemma also highlighted this issue of very quick publication timescales. So often these journals will promise that they'll be able to turn around your article in a couple of weeks, and get it out into print very quickly. That might seem very appealing, particularly if you've got a PhD viva that's imminent, or a project that's due for submission, a big funded research project where you've got timescales to publish in. But of course, that comes at a cost because the peer review process isn't likely to be very rigorous. There tends to be a lack of clarity on the peer review process, what happens, how it happens, is it blind peer review, how many reviewers? You'll often not recognise the editors or the editorial boards. Now, if you're quite an inexperienced researcher, that might be more difficult. If you've been in a field for a long time, you'll tend to know the names of people in your fields. But it is also more difficult now because of the multidisciplinary nature of research. So we may not have a knowledge of all of the different disciplines that potentially get involved in addressing disaster risk, for example. So we might not know, personally, I wouldn't know the leading medical scientists maybe who are working in emergency medicine. So those names wouldn't be necessarily familiar to me, but they might be quite credible. But be wary. Who are the editors? What's the editorial board? Do you recognise any of these people? Are they from reputable institutions? If you doubt the credibility, you can even drop the editors or the editorial board members an email and just check to see whether they are committed to this journal, whether these people actually exist. And whether they're using institutional email addresses or whether they're just sort of Gmail, Hotmail type email addresses might be another indication. You can also look at the quality of articles that have been published previously. So there might be some, you can look at the previous issues. Are these credible articles? Do they look as though they've been through a peer review process? If not, maybe doubt the quality of the journal. And contact information that uses non-professional and non-affiliated email addresses. So I mentioned that in terms of the editors and editorial board members. But if you've got queries and things around the journal, if you're dealing with, for example, our journal, there's clear email addresses for Emerald Publishing. There's email addresses for us as editors, so we can be contacted in a quite open manner. Also be wary of claims about indexing, and that they often use slightly misleading titles, so that's similar to some of the established indexing models like Scopus. They will come up with slight variations on these terms and claim to be indexed in these services. These indexing services don't even exist, or they may claim to be part of Scopus or similar, but actually when you look at the Scopus database, you can actually check whether these journals are listed or not. And similarly, in terms of COPE or DOAJ and things, these different kind of professional organizations that tend to monitor publishing and offer codes of practice, they may claim to be members, but if you actually go to these associations' websites, they do give information about who is affiliated to them and who is not. Now, another key issue to think about is authorship and contribution, and we touched upon this yesterday. But I think this issue of who should be mentioned as an author or acknowledged as an author on a paper. Now, authorship confers credit, and it does have important academic, social, and financial implications. So authorship also implies responsibility and accountability for the work. So although you can get credit, you're also accountable for it. And I think that's it's important to recognize that when identifying who is going to be an author on a paper. And it's also why it's vital that you get permission to add people as authors on your papers to make sure that they are comfortable with the work that's been published. Now, authorship itself doesn't communicate what contributions individuals have made as an author. So when you see them listed, sometimes there's very clear protocols in disciplines. So some people will list more senior researchers at the front and the more junior researchers at the bottom, even regardless of who's done the work. Others will encourage the people who contributed most to the paper to be listed first. Some may even use things like alphabetical order for the author list. So you can't just assume that the people at the front have made the most contribution to the work, but we also don't know exactly what contribution these individual authors have made. Now, some journals now are encouraging or requiring authors to explicitly state what contribution each author has made, and that's part of the kind of the peer review process, is to ensure that that's done in a transparent manner. But I think it's something you really need to think about, and as was mentioned yesterday, you need to think about it at the very early stages of the work. So, the types of things you might want to consider, and this is an example that one journal, for example, identified some criteria you might use to identify who should be an author or not. So they suggest that they should have substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, and drafting the work, revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So in ensuring that questions related to its accuracy or integrity or any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. And if you can't tick all 4 boxes, then you really should query whether that person should be an author on the work or not. So those are some criteria you could use. Now, I think this issue can be resolved best at the early stages of preparing a manuscript. So, rather than encourage lots of people to make contributions and then suddenly decide at the end who's going to be an author or not, try and identify quite early on who's going to be acknowledged as a formal author on the paper. And another option is, if you've got very large teams, you can use the acknowledgements for those people who don't meet authorship criteria. You maybe acknowledge those institutions or authors, those contributing researchers, and acknowledge that formally within the paper. But again, make sure you get permission to do that, because they may not even wish to be formally acknowledged in that manner. Another issue is in terms of disclosure and conflict of interest. So, everybody in the publication process may have issues to disclose that could affect the peer review process and undermine the rigor of that process. There may be some bias that's introduced. So, of course, the participants in a publication process include authors. So you might have relationships to subjects of the papers. Do you have affiliations to any of the institutions that the research is being carried out on? Do you have any financial interests in those institutions? Also, has it been through some formal ethical approval? And again, you should really acknowledge that in the methodology of the paper, unless the journal suggests a dedicated section for ethical approval. Now, as we mentioned yesterday, not all institutions and not all funders require ethical approval for certain disciplines, but a lot of the publication process does really require that kind of ethical approval process to have taken place. So you should consider that carefully when you're designing your research. Peer reviewers, when an article is allocated, if you receive an article inviting you to peer review an article, to peer review it, do you have any links to the research or to the subject, to the institutions, for example, that are being studied? Do you have a relationship to the author or the potential for bias? Now, of course, most peer review processes are blind. but you still might have a strong indication of who's carried out that work. Just because of the nature of the work, you might be familiar with it. So you need to be careful that there isn't a potential for a conflict of interest and a potential for bias, positive or negative. Can you keep an open mind in that peer review process? And even for editors and journal staff, so we need to be careful about publication of our own papers. So we make sure that if we're publishing a paper, that it's the actual editorial process is managed by somebody else. So they issue that paper for review, not ourselves, and they make the final decision on whether it's accepted or not. And also, of course, the relationship to the authors and the potential for bias as well. Do we have could be careful we don't just accept an article because it's a friend or somebody we like. Another issue that I think you should just be aware of is one of self-plagiarism. Now, most of us are aware of the concerns around plagiarism, and there's, you can get a lot of guidance around what is plagiarism, and what's acceptable. It's a kind of academic misconduct that tends to be taught at a very early stage. So particularly maybe at an undergraduate level, you should be getting that grounding. But self-plagiarism is something that's a little bit more difficult to navigate and may have areas of grey that we're not aware of. And so it is more complex, and actually COPE has a dedicated website, web page that outlines some of these issues. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these now, but some of the issues you might want to think about is you shouldn't really be directly replicating phrases or paragraphs from one paper to another. So if you've published your a particular paragraph in one paper, you shouldn't just copy and paste that and move it to another paper. You should be citing your original work to acknowledge that. Also, in terms of to what extent you discuss previous work and whether you're transparent and disclose that. So you should disclose, and generally as part of the submission process, they will ask you to disclose any previous related work. And I've had numerous cases where in the peer review process, it's been identified that this a piece of work has been published previously in another journal, and essentially it's replicated much of that work. It's not really offering anything new. So there should be clear citations to previous work, and you should be transparent about that when you actually submit the process, submit it. Now, of course, it can be difficult because you may be trying to publish research for different audiences, maybe for different disciplines. So what's very important is that the contributions to knowledge are different. So that, if you are going to publish similar findings, but that you clearly differentiate them by, for example, drawing out different contributions to knowledge, but also being transparent and acknowledging the other papers that you've published around that work. There can also be some complexity in terms of extracts of a thesis, and I'd very much advise you to discuss this with your PhD supervisor. So if you've published journal articles or conference articles previously, before you submit your thesis, you really should be very transparent about that in your doctoral thesis and say which extracts have been published previously. Now, a thesis is not normally considered to be published through a formal publishing process. So it doesn't have quite the same concerns with regards to plagiarism across articles as you would, for example, from a journal article to a journal article. So there is some allowance for you to replicate sections of your thesis in a journal article. But if you're going to use journal articles in your thesis, you need to be very clear about what's been extracted from the journal article. You need to be very transparent about that. Otherwise, you really could get into serious trouble. So check that out with your doctoral supervisor. It is, again, a slightly tricky area that has some grey in it. Think carefully about conference articles that are being transferred into journal articles. So unless a conference has an agreement with a journal to update and modify conference articles and publish them in maybe a special issue, then you're not allowed. Typically, conferences don't just allow you to, they don't give you copyright to be able to just replicate that in a journal. And most journals will also be very explicit and say you mustn't have published this work elsewhere. Another issue is around partitioning of a study. So, are you attempting to divide up your data set in such a way that it's just to maximize the number of publications, rather than for trying to sort of maybe clearly differentiate different contributions to knowledge, but you're just trying to multiply the number of papers that come out of a particular data set. So the guidance is not to just chop and dice your data set into as many pieces as possible, but you should try and publish your work in a way that is coherent. And if it's best published as one set, do that. Don't go out of your way to divide it up and republish the same work in a slightly different way. And I think this is something that's really been acknowledged in the last few years. I remember when I was doing my PhD, there was almost an encouragement to try and chop your thesis into as many papers as possible and try and publish all of the different aspects of the work. They're now discouraging that, and there's more of a focus on publishing quality over quantity. And finally, just in terms of ethical oversight, and of course, ethical oversight, there should be ethical oversight in the research process itself. And that's something that you need to make sure you adhere to ethical protocols in your own countries, from the funding bodies, from any regulatory bodies that are linked to your research discipline or professional bodies. But I think it is challenging, as we discussed yesterday. There's some variation across different disciplines, across different countries. But it is usually, there is usually some oversight. And I think it's important that you declare what ethical oversight has taken place in the research. And most editors or peer reviewers will ask you to confirm that in the publication process. So even if you aren't required to have ethical oversight, there may be a strong case for seeking it through your university or institution. I think most institutions would offer it if you were to request it, to show that that has taken place. And many journals will require that as part of the submission process. So I think just some closing remarks. Don't ignore ethical considerations in the publication process. And I think it's important that you do this early. It's easy to think, that you're under pressure, you need to get a publication out there. The short-term benefits of maybe getting a publication. The problem is, once a publication's in the public domain, it's there, and if the credibility of that work is later challenged, it really could damage your credibility in the future as well. And indeed, any institutions or publications that sign up to the COPE Code of Practice, they have formal processes in place. So if, for example, a journal had concerns about an author's work that was published, so if I had serious concerns about a piece of work that was submitted to the journal, to my journal that I'm editing, I have an obligation to report that through the COPE guidance and the Code of Practice. And it could go, for example, to your institution. And you could be up for academic misconduct, and there could be very serious implications from that emerging from a career perspective. So if in doubt, seek advice from senior researchers or declare in the ethical approval processes and to editors when submitting the article. It's much better that you declare, I've published some of this work in previous articles. The editor then can decide whether there are any concerns around that. You've been transparent, you've been open about it. You won't get into trouble then. They might say, well, I'm afraid you can't publish that here. You need to change that or whatever. but don't publish the article and then suffer the consequences. And just from a general, as an academic, we all have professional obligations. So journals have clearly described processes for handling allegations of misconduct and complaints. So COPE, most of these journals are now, most good journals are prescribing to these types of COPE, code of practice. So if you have any concerns, don't be afraid to raise these concerns with an editor, and they can then decide whether it's something that needs to be investigated, because we all have an obligation to protect that body of knowledge that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so that's some of the issues that I wanted to raise in terms of the ethical considerations. Now, I maybe have time for a question or two, just quickly, because I know we've run over a little bit. Now, I've one question around the number of number of authors on a paper. So, what do you think about a paper with 30 authors about research gaps? So, I think what this is saying is we have a research group that have identified 30 potential authors for a paper. Now, again, I would come back to the kind of criteria that I suggested earlier around the substantial contributions to the conception or the design of the work, the drafting of the work, the final approval of the version to be published, and the agreement to be accountable for everything that's been written. So I think the first way of saying, do all 30 of those authors have that? Do they tick all of those boxes? My question here would be, was it a good research design to involve so many people in the design of a single research paper that might be 8,000 words? Now, I think I would suggest in this sort of instance, you should maybe look at, you might have a substantial group of researchers who've helped maybe identify the literature, maybe you've scanned the literature, I've done that maybe more sort of systematic review. Perhaps they could be acknowledged in a section within the paper, but also, then who's actually done the drafting of the work and revising it critically for the intellectual content? Who's done the critical analysis within that work? And I would suggest that you don't have that many people involved in that process. Because I think it'd be very difficult to put a coherent narrative together. But secondly, because it does raise difficulties when it comes to authorship. So my suggestion would be on that to maybe, if you've got a large research team, identify early on in the process who's going to be involved in some of that drafting of the work and then revising it critically for the intellectual content. And that would be the best way to do it. I think most journals would struggle to accept an author list that large. Okay, so the another question in terms of if I want to publish a piece of my PhD data, to what extent should I do data sharing since I've not reached my viva yet? So I think there's nothing wrong with publishing findings from your research before you get to your PhD viva. I think, indeed, I would say it's advantageous. Most viva examinations go a lot more smoothly if you've already published a reputable article in a peer-reviewed journal, because to some extent, your work's already been externally validated. That aspect of your work has already been validated by a peer review body. So I would say that that's something that as a supervisor, I would encourage that. And it doesn't really pose concerns. You just need to be careful about how you cite that work within your PhD. So you need to be very transparent about that. I know at Huddersfield, and we have a separate section within the thesis that has to clearly identify which parts of the study have been published previously. So in conference papers, book chapters, journal articles, and also within the work, we have to clearly cite where work is replicated from a previously published work. As long as it's been written by the PhD candidate, it's not a problem, but it still needs to be done in a transparent manner. So I think that's a couple of questions. I hope that's been useful for you. We are running a little bit behind time, so what I'm going to suggest is that we have a break until 9:45 in terms of the UK time, which I think is 3:45 in Indonesian time. So we'll resume at 3:45 Indonesian time for the panel discussion. So I hope that's sufficient, and I'll look forward to seeing you back in about just over 15 minutes. Thank you. Well, welcome back, everybody, and we now move on to our panel discussion. And we've set the panel discussion around the idea of peer review and how we can navigate the peer review process. And I think we'll also probably pick up some of the other questions that have emerged through the workshop. But I think some of the things we might look at around the process of peer review, the type of feedback that's given and how to respond, and what editors are looking for. And I'm delighted that to contribute to the panel, we have a combination of journal editors, editorial assistants, experienced and early career researchers and conference chairs who can maybe give some idea of how the peer review process is conducted and some of the wider issues around publication. So just to start off, I'll give a brief introduction to our sort of distinguished panel. Firstly, I'm delighted that Professor Rajib from the Graduate School of Media and Governance at Keio University in Japan has joined us. I'm sure many of you will have read Professor Shaw's work, his expertise around community-based disaster risk management, climate change adaptation, urban risk management, and disaster environmental education. I think are very well cited. But I think Professor Shaw is also chair of the UN Science and Technology Advisory Group for Disaster Risk Reduction and co-chair of the Asia Science Technology Academic Advisory Group. And perhaps most relevant to our discussion here today, he's also editor of a book series on disaster risk reduction published by Springer, which is a reference point for many of us working in this field. But he's also personally published, I think, about 45 books and 300 academic papers, and probably that number's gone up, but that's the details that I looked at. We've also got from Indonesia, and I'm delighted we've got an Indonesian perspective, Professor Haryo Winarso at the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development at the Institute of Technology Bandung in Indonesia. He's head of Urban Planning and Design Research Group, and he has research interests in land and housing development, peri-urban and inner city development and mega projects. And Professor Haigh has done a lot of work and published joint research funded by the World Bank, DFID, and the government agencies of Indonesia and the Asian Development Bank. He's also the member of an editorial board for the Journal of City and Regional Planning and the International Journal of Urban Policy and Planning, as well as a peer reviewer for many journals as well. From Australia, we have Associate Professor Tayaparan Gajendran, who's the Deputy Head of School for Research and Assistant Dean for Work Integrated Learning at the University of Newcastle. Gajendran's research focuses on sociological aspects associated with the built environment in the context of construction, project and disaster management. And I think specific areas of attention include the cultural analysis of permanent and temporary organisations to explore and explain ICT adoption, innovation behaviour and project governance. And Gajendran has authored and edited over 60 pieces of work, including refereed conference papers and conference proceedings. So again, another perspective. And finally, Dr. Chatu Jayakodi, who's a postdoctoral researcher here at Huddersfield at the Global Disaster Resilience Centre. And her work is in the areas of built environment perspectives on displacement planning, designing sustainable shared spaces and public open spaces, urban planning and urban designing interventions for disaster resilience. I think Chatu brings an important perspective in the early career researcher perspective. So Chatu got her PhD last year, and I think is facing that situation a lot of early career researchers have, which is how to publish their PhD work and really start developing their publication profile. And Chatu is also the editorial assistant for the International Journal for Disaster Resilience in the Built Environment. So she actually manages a lot of the peer review process and sees how that process takes place behind the scenes. So we've got quite an open discussion, an experienced panel. I'd encourage you all to contribute your questions to the panel, which I'll try and pick up as we go through the session. And so we can maybe pick up some of the points that you've been raising over the course of the workshop as well. But I think just to start things off, I'd like to look at why do we go through the stress and sometimes pain of going through a peer review process? I think any of you've been through the process, it can be quite daunting in the early stages of your career. It can be quite painful when we get negative feedback about our work, which I'm sure we've all had. Why do we do it? Professor Shaw, you've been through this process a lot of times, and you've also you've been responsible for peer review processes. So what is the value it brings?
Thank you, Richard. First, thank you very much for inviting me, and I congratulate the organizers for organizing this such a very, very interesting training come interaction session. I saw the program. I was not been able to join the earlier sessions, but I saw the program. So I think this is really, really enriching, especially for the young researchers. So my heartiest congratulations to all of you. Now, why should we publish? Now, if you see that, to me, I think one of the best important starting point of publishing is the self-motivation. There might be thousands of other reasons. Sometimes you are so-called forced to publish. Like for your PhD, you need 2 or 3 international journal paper. That's one part. For your career development, for promotion from assistant to associate to full professor, you need X number of high impact factor journal paper. That's one of the, I will say, possibly the push factor for publishing. But more than the push factor, I think to me, one of the greatest pull factor is my self-motivation. Like I do a good research, and I always tell my students that nobody will read your thesis, even you will not read your thesis after you publish, after you finish it. And if you read it after 5 years and 10 years, then you will see, what? I wrote this one? And it often happens actually with most of the students. But the journal paper or the chapters in the book which you will read, which you will write, that will read by a wider audience and wider reader. So the self-motivation should be like to get people know about your own research. That's first thing. And by doing that, you also enrich the whole subject. Like all of us, we understand that when we start a research, our starting point is the literature review. We try to look at that what has been done so far on that particular topic. So if our earlier researchers, if they would not have written, it's very difficult for us to start a research just from the zero. So I think like more we write, more we not only get our work spreaded to larger audience, but also we enrich this particular subject. And like, say, for example, if you see this whole disaster risk reduction field, which have been evolved now, I always say that it's now 30 plus years old. If you say 1990, the International Decade of Natural Disaster Reduction is the starting point. And with these 30 years, at the beginning, there were hardly any journals, maybe 1 or 2 journals where you can actually publish for this type of multi-transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research. But now we have at least 10 to 12 or maybe 12 to 15 journals which are Scopus indexed, and some of them has moderate to good impact factor. So I think this has been only possible because people started publishing this type of interdisciplinary research or multidisciplinary research. So these 2 points, one is you motivate yourself, you get other people to know about what you have done, and then you also contribute for the development of that particular academic field. I will stop here for the time being. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Rajib. So I think that self-motivation is obviously very important. I just wonder, can we translate that into an Indonesian context, Professor Haigh? Is it, what's driving academics in Indonesia? Is it that self-motivation, or is it external pressures, for example, promotion or otherwise? I think you're muted.
Okay. Okay. First of all, of course, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk in this very important, I think, important event, important workshop, because particularly for Indonesian researchers. Yes, your question is well, that's very right. I mean, I'm totally agree with what Rajib has mentioned about the personal motivation. This is very important, but unfortunately, for Indonesian researcher, perhaps this is still well, what I can say, not really low, but because they are not experienced in writing for international journal. And there's also a debate, pro and cons, within our researchers. One saying that no, we have to, publish in local journal or domestic because it's Indonesian case, and it should be read by Indonesian because then they can learn. On the other side, saying no, you have to go to Scopus index journals and preferably the high impact, more than 4 or 5, not less than 2 or something like that. Then there's this one. But now the government, of course, now pushing very hard for all the researchers, especially in the university, that they have to write article if you want to go from assistant professor to associate, and associate to professor. They have to produce, and they have, the government will give the funding for research, provided that they have to publish the research result in international journal. Well, then the question remains: why international journal? Why not national journal? Well, the government also no, they have other other goals in publishing this research article for university. They are trying to going to the rank, a university rank, right? One of the university rank is a published article. So this is now become very pressure to the researcher, the university students, even master students. They have to to publish the article. Of course, PhD students, they have to publish the article. But then I will suggest that actually you better publish in international or high impact journal. Then you can also translate into Indonesian and put it in the repository. Of course, you can click actually because there's something like common license for this that is not that difficult actually. Some is free, some have to pay, but you have to ask for the license, and then you can translate in Indonesian. Again, here the who comes with the international publishing journal, then you can say no, I will have international journal, but also in Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesian language. But again, I'm very agree with what Rajib have mentioned about the personal. This is more important, I think. But right now, at this point, at this step, perhaps pressure from the government, pressure from the university that they have to publish is the solely motivation for all the researcher in Indonesia. Yeah, I will stop here now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you should say that, because actually a few years ago, Ristek Dikti, as they were then, I think the institutional name has changed, but Ristek Dikti we're very much encouraging Delante and I to organise a workshop on publishing. This was their sort of main driver, was to actually increase the citations of Indonesian researchers, and so it's been a major sort of strategic driver. But I think your point, both your points actually about the personal motivation is very important in terms of you can't just rely on it being external pressures from a career perspective. Now, I'm just wondering, Dr. Gajendran, you're obviously in Australia. I think it's also quite a competitive environment in academia now. What's the feeling in Australia? Is there a lot of pressure to publish? Are you how do you go about deciding what to publish and where?
Richard, and thank you for inviting for this forum. And I have to say, I listened a little bit of your talk before this. I went to the wrong room probably, but I thoroughly enjoyed the discussions. And I wish that years ago we had such forums to support early career researchers. So it's a wonderful initiative. So thank you for that. You and Delante on that, and other organizers. I agree with Professor Shaw and Professor Winarso about the conditions and the way you talked about quality over quantity. So in Australia, as in the UK, what we have is something called a research quality exercise. So the journals papers are seen as higher outputs than books. So there's a hierarchy that the government feels that the quality of the publications, although it may vary within journals, you have to publish in high quality outputs, and also you have to make sure that they have a wider reach. So these are the two major things the Australian government is looking at. Not interested in quantity, high quality, and the reach. Now, in a sense that internal motivation and external pressures, it's absolutely true that some people publish for making sure that they got a job. Some people actually publish to a body of knowledge. And Professor Shaw told that disaster risk reduction area is about 30 years old. And if you are in a university, particularly, and if you're doing a PhD, it's all about a body of knowledge and where you position yourself. And if you don't publish in academic journals, you don't actually, in Australian context, you don't position yourself in a body of knowledge for people to talk about your work, or even an identity within that field. So you might not feel that you're not an academic if you're not part of that community. So the journal papers actually going through that process gives you that identity, your confidence you are part of it. We call it that imposter syndrome. Some people have that, am I really, am I really good at it? And these papers are validated by your colleagues. And that's what the peer review does. The peer review, what it does is that it tells that your work is being accepted by your colleagues. And more it's rigorous the review, you feel more confident that you are part of that community and a body of knowledge. So there are two things. One is absolutely the pressure to publish, but even that pressure now has come to the point that who you are, what you are, where you are publishing, and where you're positioning. So early career researchers, I see it's very, very, very important. You position yourself very early. You leave your publications later, your data gets old, your work gets old. So get it through that process and publish. And we are very serious in Australia about setting up a career trajectory for early career researchers. And part of it is getting into the high impact venue. So we have just be careful to say journal only. The reason is you have got creative artists who may be working in disaster field. They might do exhibitions and other things. Again, we had a very interesting discussion with Richard about quality of those outlets. It's very hard, but journal articles absolutely have that rankings fairly set. So I feel that that's a way to go if you're an early career researcher to get your name in. Thank you. I stop there.
Thank you, Gajendran. I think that's a good point to bring in Dr. Chatu, because of course you just finished your PhD last year. So what has been your strategy, I suppose, in terms of did you start publishing during your PhD, or is it something you focused on more afterwards?
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Richard, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this panel discussion. So if I speak from the early career researcher's perspective, it's sometimes really difficult because we get some scholarships. It says within your PhD, when you are completing your PhD, you need to publish 2 journals. It comes as a requirement as part of the scholarship. So within that hope, it's difficult to achieve because you need to get good findings and you need to find a journal that which matches to your scope of the research and then publishing it. So if you start the process as soon as you start getting the findings, it will be good for early career research. Otherwise, it will be difficult to publish it within the time scale of your PhD and then after that.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. Okay, so I think we've got agreement that you know, there's a need to publish, and it's also from a personal motivation. That there should be a strong personal motivation, but it's also an expectation now as well externally for us to publish. So one of the challenges we all face is that there's so many publication opportunities. You know, whether it's conferences, whether it's journals, whether it's books. Monographs, book chapters, you know, there's different, and you know, Gajendran also mentioned that there are other approaches, you know, particularly other fields. I know I was working closely with a kind of art and design school, and their outputs, you know, are completely different to the types of papers that we would normally look at. So how do you go about choosing, you know, when you have a piece of research that you're working on, how do you go about selecting the most appropriate channel? And I'm thinking, for example, Rajib, do you, when you're looking at books or journal articles, you know, what's the kind of thinking that goes into where to try and place a piece of research? Is there a thought process behind that?
Thank you, Richard. I think when we compare a journal article and a book, to me, the best judging part would be like how much originality you have in your specific analysis. Like if you really are confident that, yes, this is a very original article, original analysis, I prefer to publish that in an index journal. And if it is more like an overview of some issues, possibly it's not a very original one, but more like a literature review part. Of course, you can also publish literature review journal article as well. But if it is more, you are narrating some problem, you have read maybe around 50, 60 papers on that particular topic and try to reflect with your own analysis that this is the current status of this particular issue, then possibly that fits more for a book chapter. But by saying that, again, for journal article, it also depends like which type of journal article it is. As I mentioned that, yes, it can be a literature review article. It can be a maybe methodology-based article. It can be possibly a case study-based article. So it all will depend on like what is your main focus. And when I say the methodology, like the literature part is quite straightforward. But when I'm saying a methodology based, then possibly you are trying to, what is the originality of that particular journal article is put a new methodology. Possibly you have analyzed that, okay, these are different types of methodology exist. These are the positive side. These are the pitfalls. And then based on that, I am proposing a new methodology. So I think that type of analysis can possibly better to go for a journal article. And I also understand that for an early career researcher or possibly a PhD student or even the master student who are writing the journal article, maybe it's sometimes challenging to make that judgment by themselves. So I always encourage in our group, at least like that before coming to me, please talk to your other senior students, because they faced the same problem 2 years back. Like if I have a PhD student, third year PhD student, he faced the same problem 2 years back. So he knows actually that particular struggle, rather than I tell my students, okay, you should go for this one, you should go for this high impact factor journal. So I think that sort of discussion among the young researchers or among the young students, little bit from the experienced students by giving a little bit of information or sharing some of the lessons for the younger students. I think that, at least I found, it becomes quite effective in some way.
Yeah.
The degree of mentorship maybe is taking place. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, one also, I think something is that actually when you choosing book or journal article, one also have to think about the journal article sometimes is faster than a book chapter. Sometimes, of course, there is a journal that is very long, but usually if you look writing for book chapter, it can be 2 years or so. So it's then depend on your topic research. Is it something that very new that you are eager to show it to the world? Then perhaps you choose the journal with high impact, for instance. But if you think that this is actually part of a big thought on something, and you can work together with other people, then book chapter will be very good. I think that's also one thing that we can choose. Of course, for PhD student, it's not easy to choose which one, but you can ask the senior and try to understand. If in Indonesian case, perhaps you can write in Bahasa Indonesia first, then you can try if you get more input for your article, and you can try to choose whether it is for book or for the journal. That's
okay. Thank you, Haryo. So, and I'm just thinking. So, when I think several of you have mentioned the issue of either external quality assessments or internal promotions sort of situations. What criteria are being applied by these panels, and whether it's your university promotions panel, whether it's for a job application, what are they looking for? Are they looking for purely index journals, or are they taking account of books, book chapters? Do they do some kind of quality assessment when they're looking at promotions?
in Indonesia, there's the regulation for from assistant professor or professor to from associate professor to professor. It has to be international index, Scopus index journal. Not book chapter is lower than this journal. So that's if we look at this. But other you can at least you make a publication.
Okay. And
just from the context, it's similar, Richard. But they are trying to use a bit more inclusive language, saying that you have to show leadership in an area and in a particular knowledge domain. That leadership generally, traditionally, and even still, I believe, and probably most of us believe, it comes from high-ranked journals. But what they are trying to do is that you have to convince the panel. So they are not stipulating anything, saying that, oh, you have to publish in A-star journals or something like that. They're starting to say Q1 journals they're finding it a bit comfortable to say you should have high-ranked journal papers. And then they are not discounting book chapters. What they are looking at is where you are making the most impact. So certain disciplines, maybe the readership and the impact happens through book chapters or reports and change things at the ground. But definitely they look at the theoretical contribution through the journals, and they look at the impact that the research has made through other outlets. So the hierarchy is fluid based on the story you create to justify your promotion. But I don't think anyone will get promoted without a single journal paper, or I mean, they could argue anything. I've done so many reports, I've made something in the ground, but they would look for that top-end journal, at least 20% of the outputs.
So maybe the impression that there's been a kind of almost a prejudice against non-journal outputs, but maybe some of these bodies now are being a bit more open-minded, perhaps, but I know in the UK that the Research Excellence Framework, they're increasingly not providing citation data, for example, for the assessment of outputs. So they're expecting the panel themselves to review the outputs and look at the quality of them rather than rely on external judgments. But I think one of the challenges as academics we face is that the criteria keep sort of changing and evolving. So you can't be certain what things are going to be like in a few years' time. But
that's been a biggest problem. Then one point I also want to make that Professor Shaw said is that 30 years ago, there was no body of knowledge. The universities recognize a discipline based on how much body of knowledge is out there. And disaster management has always found it difficult to embed itself as a body of knowledge. Publishing has an altruistic perspective also, that by publishing, we are creating that identity for the discipline, and the universities take it more serious. Otherwise, they say it's a wet sector education, or they say it is not a non-university sector education. So we publishing more gives us a very strong discipline.
So that raises a really interesting point, because I think it is something that's changed a lot in my, over the last 20 years. When I graduated, there was very much a focus on a single disciplinary perspective, and the particular, where there were maybe just a handful of journals that people were directed to publish in. We now almost have the opposite challenge, which is you can publish across all sorts of disciplinary journals and come at it from a quite different angle. Most journals now are quite accepting of other disciplinary perspectives. Do you have any advice, and this really is an open question to the whole panel, do you have any advice for authors? Should they be looking at disaster risk type journals, or should they be looking at particular journals that have a very high standing in their own disciplines or in a particular discipline? Do you have any views?
Well, I'm not the expert in disasters. Yeah, but I think the impact factor is more important for something like this. If you want to see which one, multidisciplinary is very important right now. It's the trend. I mean, you can you can choose multidisciplinary journal which perhaps have more audience. Well, for I don't know, for the disasters, yeah.
Rajib?
Richard, if I may, I think it again depends on the nature of the research. So for example, if someone is working on the seismic safety or the earthquake safety of a building, and he has done some good analysis either from the experiment or from the modeling, definitely his or her priority would be to publish it in the high impact factor journal like the ASCE or the earthquake spectra, or more like the journals which are possibly more specialized on the civil engineering or the earthquake engineering. But if it is more a sort of, say for example, if someone is doing a post-recovery analysis, socioeconomic analysis of a particular area, so then I think we need to go for a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary outlet. And like the journal which you do, or the journal, say for example, like the International Journal for Disaster Risk Science, IJDRR, then International Journal for Disaster Risk Reduction, like both these IJDRR, IJDRS, your journal, Disaster Prevention and Management. So I think those type of journals possibly accommodate more on the multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research. So depending on the nature of the work, possibly we need to little bit selective about the type of the journal. So that's why I always encourage our students that carefully read the scope of the journal, because every journal has very clearly written its scope of work. And if you think that the work which you are doing is fitting in that particular scope. I think that reading and understanding the scope of the journal is very important.
Gentlemen, yeah.
Richard, I think the scope and the reach, what you want is very important when we choose the journal. But I think as early career researchers, a lot of exploration may be challenging. So, for example, some people try to publish in a journal that wasn't conventionally publishing disaster research in their mainstream disciplines, for example, construction management or architecture or whatever. So if it was with a senior academic with clearly crafted message, and they are trained and mentored, I would probably recommend that approach. But if they are trying to explore the field, post PhD or during their PhD, very specifically with a set of data and a problem that is targeted to a journal, my advice would be to go there, because otherwise, it is, as you would know, changing disciplinary norms are not that easy in certain disciplines. So, when you do a multidisciplinary research and trying to change the norms of your own discipline, as an early career researcher, might be a bit challenging, but it might be senior academics who probably encourage them and work with them to get there. But if it was someone trying to explore their own areas, I would probably stick to the disciplinary ones, apart from the audience and apart from the rankings.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just take a couple of questions from the audience going through. I think relevant to our discussions at the moment. The first is actually from I think a PhD candidate who's maybe in their second year of study, and they think they already have some findings that are good enough for publication, but their supervisors have asked them to actually wait until the third year. Do you think it's best to publish early in the PhD cycle, or wait to get more robust findings and then publish perhaps a stronger article later in your PhD? Do you have any advice? Chatu, do you want to? I don't know if you have any views. You've maybe faced this dilemma yourself recently.
Yes, I think it's a very familiar question to me as well, because when we don't have robust findings, it's always our supervisors and seniors say, wait till get to some robust findings and then publish on a really good article in high impact journal. I think when you have just literature review and those findings and the conceptual framework before going to the data collection like that, based on your literature findings, it's sometimes good to publish, as I experienced, because then you get your comments on it from the very international perspective and then from the expert peer reviewers, and then you can amalgamate those comments as well for your final framework and to proceed with the findings like that. So there's a benefit as well publishing at the early stage of the PhD, so you can amalgamate those things to your findings and the analysis. So benefit publishing.
Thanks, Chatu. That sounds like good advice. I'd also refer it back to the supervisor, and generally your supervisors offer good advice on these types of issues. So I would be reluctant to go against my supervisor's perspective. But I suppose a linked issue on that is, what are the factors influencing the acceptance for a journal that has a good impact factor? So what are the high impact journals looking for in an article, besides technical aspects like good English or new methods, plagiarism? Is there anything else, in your experience as academics, you've seen that, what differentiates the high impact journal article from a run-of-the-mill article? Any perspectives with Gemma?
It's the contribution at the end of the day. I believe, you're an editor, so you would know when you look at it, it is a contribution unique. High impact journals generally look for very niche and a very solid contribution to existing body of knowledge. Most of the time, with my PhD students, my experience is that if they try to publish too early, with slicing and dicing, some people go against our advice and publish, and the feedback is that it is not a novel contribution, or it's it's nothing significantly new. So the good journals, apart from everything else, solid methodology, good data, ethical practices, everything else, to publish, you need to have a significant contribution that people would be, the reviewers and the community that reads the papers would find it useful, rather than it has been rehashed and it's the same thing put back. So book chapters and books may be a little bit more receptive to such things, but high impact journals, in my view, look for that contribution, the killer contribution that you are making to the body of knowledge.
Thank you, Jen. Any other comment? That sounds like a very appropriate analysis. Any other factors? I suppose another comment, again linked about quality of journals, is do you think the sort of Q1, Q2 is a reliable measure of quality, particularly as it seems that journals seem to jump around quite a lot year to year? So how reliable are these indexing services?
Yeah, I just came across a journal Q1, but the quality is, it's not good. I'm very disappointed with this Q1. So I think it's not really reliable, because it's not only the Q1, Q2, Q3 is, changing say every time, but also the quality sometimes doesn't. No, the Q1 doesn't reflect the quality of the journal in terms of English and that what is it, the contribution, the novelty of the articles. So not really reliable, because we can have same Q1 journal, but the impact factor is very different. The other one is less than 2. The other can be more than 5.9, something like that. In our subject planning, 4.9 or 5 is very high. Less than 2 there are, but same Q1. And also I found that there's a very good journal, and it's been more than 100 years, I think. It's very long, but it's still Q2, but the quality is very, very good. So I don't know, this is not very reliable, but we still use this for our criteria for promotion. Yeah.
So it's one aspect, but you need to take account of other quality indicators as well. So no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's just move on a little bit to in terms of the peer review process itself. When an article gets submitted to a journal or to a book, for consideration in a book, why do articles get rejected before they even go out for peer review? Chatu, do you have what's your experience of that for journals?
Yes, Richard. When a manuscript is received by a journal, firstly it will be screened by the editor or associate editor or an editorial assistant. So the first main thing that they would check is whether the topic fits the scope of the journal or the scope of the book. So this is one of the main reasons, and I think all the other our co-panelists mentioned about this scope. For an example, the journal I assist, International Journal of Disaster Resilience in Built Environment, focuses on research that examined sustainable construction, urban development, the built environment role for disaster resilience. Still, we receive some articles which focuses on pharmaceutical supply chain or the health science, totally focus on that. So the straight answer for that would be the rejection. While we welcome multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives, there should be at least some link to the core of the scope of the journal. So this may sound obvious, but some authors misunderstand the scope of the journal which they submit. And this is one of the major reasons for articles getting rejected. And the second reason would be not complying with the submission guide. The format, language, or the length of the submission need to be consistent with the expectations of the journal. This information is normally there under author guidelines, and your article needs to be comply with those submission guidelines. Sometimes the manuscript is not complete. It may be lacking the key elements of such as title, references sometimes. The English is not sufficient for peer review process. So these are the basic reasons for articles getting rejected at the initial screen. And there are also another reason is they check sometimes whether there are no basic procedural problems. This involves checking the author is not violating the journal's policy. For example, for such behavior include resubmitting an unrevised version of previously rejected article, possibly with a new title or a small extension to it, can be a reason. So whatever the policy of the journal has in place will matter. And also, I think they sometimes check whether there are no obvious ethical violation. I think this matter was raised at the breakout groups yesterday, whether not having ethical approval can be a kind of a barrier to publish your article. So practices and threshold may vary, but most journals are becoming more and more cautious about this publishing journal that has not compiled with commonly accepted standards of ethical rigor. So this can be a reason as well. So then quality of the article, especially when you are submitting your article to a high quality scholarly article, it goes through intense scrutiny. So the procedure or the analysis of the data may be defective, the conclusion cannot be justifiable. So these may be one of the reasons that your article getting rejected at the initial screen. So basically these are the reasons as I.
Thanks, Chatu. So, and I think this point, even Gajendran mentioned earlier about the contribution to knowledge. So as you're going up the quality of the journal, even before it goes out for peer review, a lot of journals will start to look for that clear contribution. If it's not evident, it won't even get to the peer review phase. It just gets immediately rejected. So that's obviously an important factor. But also this just complying with basic author guidelines is obviously very important. Any other points to add? I think that was a fairly good agenda.
That's an interesting point, because a lot of the PhD students at early career researchers, when they have a set of data, they think they have got a paper. I think that's where a lot of the times they fail, because they want to report the data. They don't have a proposition or a clear question or clear aim to guide their contribution. So I've got new data, fresh data I'm going to publish. Is the one probably ends up in desktop rejection, because as I mentioned earlier, that the contribution is not there, or the clear narrative is not there, and you could pick up very easily as a person going through it. So the early stages. So having a set of data, that's something I heard a couple of times in the comments or in the chat box, is that doesn't equate to a journal paper. Data is only, it's only collected for a purpose, and what is that purpose, and what is that you want to prove, or what is that you want to explore needs to be clear. A lot of the times I've got these, all these ambitious PhD students who want to publish very early. Going back to that, I'm publishing early because I've got data has been rejected desktop because they didn't know what to do with the data, and waiting a little bit gives two things. One, clarity of what it's really doing, and two, again, as you said, once you publish, you can't retract. So you say something that is ill-informed, and then your full data set says something else. How do you reconcile that contradiction? So the supervisor's name's on that, and they'll be quite cautious to say one message, clear, articulate message.
I think it is a big challenge for PhD students. They often try and get the kind of 80, 100,000 word thesis and condense it into a journal article. It doesn't really work. So it needs a complete rewrite, and as you said, maybe to narrow the scope to a the most significant contributions for a journal. So some really good points there. Okay, so let's move a little bit further along the peer review process, and maybe you can answer this from either as an editor or as from a peer reviewer perspective or as an author. But how should you respond to feedback? Because I think we've all received negative feedback in an article. You might get feedback that you disagree with, or you might, and actually this links to one of the questions, you might get an editor-in-chief in this case, somebody was suggesting, was asking to cite more from his or her journal. So do you think, is that appropriate? Or if reviewers are suggesting to cite very specific papers, particularly if you don't know who the reviewer, you don't know who the peer reviewer is, but maybe there seems to be an indication that they're citing their own articles. So how do you respond to feedback, whether you agree with it or disagree with it? Any initial strategies that you have? Rajib, do you want to start off?
I think that's a very important point. I have seen, like when I do my journal work, and I have seen that some of the reviewers have suggested citation of their own paper, and it often happens. If some of the reviewers has done similar type of work, they said that, okay, look at these things, these are important papers, and like that. It's a human nature, actually. It's very difficult to get rid of that. But by saying that, I think there is no harm in citing some additional paper. But important part is that the bottom line is that you don't need to agree on each and every comment. Like if you agree on every reviewer's comment, then your flow of the paper is gone. So you need to be very, very careful that, okay, I have around 10 comments as a major revision from reviewer 1. I have around 15 comments maybe from reviewer 2 for the same major revision, and maybe if I have another reviewer, maybe around 3 to 4 comments. So possibly what I always suggest my student to at least first try to look at all the comments and try to little bit disaggregate them, that where these comments are for. Are they challenging their methodology? Or are they challenging their literature review part, like that, how in depth you have gone, or maybe you are missing some key literature? Or are they challenging that, okay, your discussion part is not that well evolved like that? So once we have a little bit of the categorization of the comments from all the 2 or 3 reviewers, then you will be able that if some people are really like all the 3 reviewers, if they're focusing on the comments on the methodology, then that means that there are something possibly a little bit not wrong, but possibly we need to revise or we need to relook about that methodology part. So like the categorization of the comments, try to see where the comments are more focused on, and then based on that, the response to the comments would be possibly one good way of looking at this.
Very good. So particularly, you might get several sets of comments and they don't necessarily agree. So understanding where those kind of common patterns are across the reviews is obviously very important. Okay, any other views?
Yeah, even if you are rejected, right, and there is a comment, right, you have to read that, I think. No, not I think. You have to read, because they give, validity of your research, and we can learn from what the reviewer just mentioned there. Which one is very important, or we don't have to agree with all, but at least we can learn from this, and then we can send to other journal if it's rejected with improvement using what the reviewer just mentioned. So I think it's very important whether is it rejected or a major revision. It's very important that we have to learn what the reviewer just mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of those dilemmas, isn't it? I think it's a bit like a PhD vibe. Sometimes you need to know when to defer and agree with the examiner, or whether you robustly defend what you've done and how strong your position is. And that's I think it's a challenge we all face at different times in our career. Gajendran, Chatu, any other thoughts?
Yeah, Richard, I think I agree with you all. Like, you don't need to always agree with the comments, but when you're responding to that comment, it's always good to be polite and respectful for all the authors. Even if you're not convinced that the reviewer has understood the subject matter that you are trying to highlight, you need to be polite. Keep in mind that if the reviewer failed to understand something, that means fault likely lies, at least part of it likely lies with you, for not making the point clear enough to the reviewer. So always try to respond with polite and respectful.
Yeah, I think even that goes for peer reviewers. Sometimes peer reviewers can be a little blunt in their assessments. So tone of language is important. I think that's a really good point.
I think this is one of the major part of any ECR or even a senior academic, responding to comments. And it is not something you can learn in a year or two. You always learn how to respond. But all the comments that given by the panel is brilliant. Be patient, be respectful, and don't respond immediately. Shoot an email with anger, look at the comments very carefully. And 99% of the time, no one wants to disrespect you for any reason. They have written, time-poor academics write very bluntly. People who have time writes very politely. So don't judge your review or comment that they are out for you. So you take your time, answer every review comment, whether you agree or disagree. Having a response is very important. If you disagree, then you have to justify why you disagree. The editors will look at it. Even sometimes you decide if it's a major revision and if it's never going to get in, then you have to pick it up. For example, recently one of our PhD students' work was questioned on the methodological software used. He can't go and change the software he used for that paper. Because some journals are very particular about what type of software you use, and they don't believe the algorithm behind it. So if the reviewers and the editors don't believe that particular software is, although it may be accepted by other disciplines in a particular journal, I wouldn't waste my time even making revisions, because then you're completely redoing the paper for some reviewer who doesn't believe in the software. But if they find the error in the reporting, yes, definitely, you have to respond, or if they did misunderstood, you respond. So you need to decide even whether you are going to respond or back. So that for that, as earlier said, you have to read every comment. Just don't skip.
And I think that's a good point, because sometimes also the editor will overrule the peer reviewer. So if you put a good case forward as to why that particular method was used, even if that comment came back in the first line of reviewers, it may be overruled by the editor, and who's happy with the defense you've offered. So they may not categorically reject it. So you could have a dialogue with the editor, for example, couldn't you, to address that type of issue. Okay, that's great. Okay, a few more questions coming on through the Q&A. Some advice on publishing articles when not related to funded projects. So how do you develop new ideas to write? So I think maybe the thinking behind the question is that sometimes you might feel intimidated when you see a lot of research that's being published, which has millions of pounds of funding behind it. Can you compete with that kind of level? Does it matter really if you have those kind of sponsors and funding behind your project? Gajendran? Oh,
yeah,
Haigh?
yeah. I don't think so. I mean, many of PhD students without funding can also, publish a very good article, journal article. So it doesn't matter whether you're funded or not. But like Rajib mentioned, personal, motivation is more important than whether is it funded or not. Or but if you have a motivation for writing something, you can do this. Yeah.
I agree with the professor also. The money is not always the indicator of the contribution of research or the quality of research. I mean, we usually argue that some of the engineers bring $10 million and it's to buy one equipment, so it has not been sent, so someone has sponsored for 10 million doesn't necessarily mean it was used in the research. It's an equipment plan. I think the key part is, again, I go back to this body of knowledge where you are going to contribute, what you are going to contribute, and then finding data or using the data to to analyze your problem. So I remember 10 years ago when I put my ethics application, I had to clearly say that this is what this data is going to be used, and I can't use that data outside the scope. Now the funding bodies have come and said, you have collected this rich data and you are limiting it to be used in a particular context. So that's why this data sharing and using those data for meaningful research purposes, other than the original purpose, has been widely accepted in Australia. So if you have collected as part of your PhD data for a particular purpose, but it's a rich quality data which can be used through a different lens or a different theory to analyze, I do encourage them. So how do you get those ideas? It comes from actually going back to the professor's talk earlier, that by reading your journal articles, you find the gap, research gaps, or by being in practice, you find the gap. And if your data through 2 projects you collected for very different projects can be put, as long as they are relevant, they are not old data and you can justify, you could actually publish. You don't need a lot of money for that. So going back to where do you get the ideas to write? It comes from finding the research gaps that people have identified in journal articles and say, look here, I think this is a future research opportunity, or this needs to be done. Or in practice, when you go out, the NGOs or people on the ground will say, look here, no one has solved this problem to us. Can you please look at it? So those are the inspiration for ideas. And then you have to be careful with the practice problem, because people would have solved it a number of times in academic journals. So you need to have a different lens to solve it. Otherwise, it goes back to the problem of what is the contribution. And every time our undergraduate students come for a research in undergraduate thesis, I want to solve the sustainability problem. And we say, it's so broad, people have written a lot, but what is that? I want to find a sustainable technology. Which technology? So it's about getting to that level of clarity and the small problem you want to solve. That's how you find ideas.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time you can big research grants actually for big funded research projects have quite a strong impact requirement. I mean, they're expected to make some quite significant change to the context that they're being applied. So it doesn't always make for a great journal article in many cases. Okay, any other thoughts on that? Okay, maybe a question for Haigh in the first instance. In Indonesia, there's a kind of obligation to disseminate papers or articles on Scopus indexed proceedings, whereas most of the universities in Europe, where they have conferences, that they're not, a lot of them are not Scopus indexed. So is there a very strong requirement in Indonesia for them to be published in Scopus indexed proceedings? Does that carry a lot of weight?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this is, they're always asking about this. I mean, yes, Scopus indexing proceeding, which is very few actually, and I understand also in European countries usually doesn't have this or don't use this one. But I mean, if you want to participate in the conference, actually what we are looking for is a good conference, like those who are what is it, by the university, a good university, or by good association like a regional Royal Geographical Association in UK or AHG in United States. So if we see that the organizing committee of this conference is good, then actually the panel will also look at this. This is a very it's very prestigious conference, which of course is better than sometimes I'm also, this is indexing Scopus, but who is the organizer? It doesn't really know. So I would say that no, don't really, rely on this corpus indexing proceeding, but look at the who organized the conference, because actually in the conference you can get a lot of input for your research paper that then you can write it for the high impact journal article. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, it's that oversimplification of just focusing on indexing maybe and not considering other factors.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're coming near the end of our time, and we're coming near the end of the workshop as well. So of course, I'm hoping that a lot of the researchers who have taken part in the workshop are enthused to go out and maybe either start scientific writing or maybe look to improve their writing. What final bit of advice do you have for researchers who are just starting that publication journey? Perhaps looking to publish their first research article at a reputable conference or journal. Where do they start? So just a very quick tip maybe for our listeners to take away. And maybe if I can start with you, Rajib, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. 3 quick suggestions and 1 word of caution. Suggestion number 1 is never give up. Try, try, try. Yes, you will fail, but once you give up, then possibly that's the end of your research. Number 2 is don't be shy. Means many times we are very much like shy that, oh, we have got so much of comments from the reviewers and possibly my whole research is bad. So we actually sometimes possibly are not been able to discuss that more openly. So don't be shy. Everybody has to start from somewhere. So even if you get nasty comment, don't be shy to think about that or to discuss with someone. And the third point is never compromise on the quality. So if you have good quality, and also I think Gajendran also pointed out this one, the contribution to that particular subject. If you have a good quality, I think definitely try, you will come back possibly, but once again try, 3 times you try, it will get. But one caution actually I'd really like to make highlight here. Nowadays, this whole journal publishing has become a big spam. And there have been so many different types of mails, and some people will invite you that, oh, you be our advisory board member. You just publish one journal paper, and then there are so many spam mail. And sometimes for a young researcher, it's very, very difficult actually to judge that which is spam, which is not spam. Then people will say, okay, we are running short of paper. So if you just give the paper by this date, we will publish it very quickly. And then you will see that, okay, it will reach you to some submitting some APC, and this total thing is a total fraud and all this type of thing. So be very, very careful on this type of spam and the second grade journal. And again, like try to discuss this or make it more open. If you don't know, just consult your colleagues or consult your senior or consult your professors. I think that's very, very important. And it's really a matter of like very serious scientific scam, which is like this whole globally it is coming up. I don't know how to address this one, but this is a matter of serious, serious concern for good publication. We need to be very, very careful about that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a point we touched upon in the last session, actually. And I think one of the challenges is that once your paper is in the public domain, it's very difficult to retract. I mean, a lot of these sort of predatory journals don't have retraction policies, and it's very difficult to remove your work. So you've got it's sort of a long-term damage to your credibility if you make that mistake. So yeah, I certainly second that. Professor Haryo?
Yes, this is particularly for Indonesian. Usually their barrier is language. Sometimes most of these young researchers and always, well, I cannot write it in English, and my English is bad, it's not good, and they don't have the courage to write it down. So I would advise that don't worry about this. If you cannot write in English, in good English, even you can write in Bahasa Indonesia first, because try, then you can translate and ask for the native speaker for this. Of course, there are some funding needed for this translation, but at least you start. Otherwise, you never start. If you think, I cannot write it because it has to be in English and my English is bad, then you never start with this. So my advice is write, even if in Bahasa Indonesia. Thank you.
Very good point. And Gajendran?
Yeah, I think, very good advices have already been given. One of the challenge for early career researchers, the first paper, is that the nervousness and, as said, where to start, and the language, and what is the best venue. These are the things that others can help. But one thing that you have to do is that, as it was discussed before by both professors, is that your confidence, and you're doing it for yourself, to put yourself to be scrutinized, to become a part of a community. So you have to believe in it in your first paper from itself. You might have a lot of doubts about yourself, whether you are there or not, but you have to start and you have to make the first go. Any comments come back, in anything, how can I put it, very aggressive, you have a network community. This is the best time you can learn with your supervisors, your fellow PhD students. You can yarn it out. When you are on your own, it's very different. When you get more senior and senior, sometimes your circle, sometimes, not all shrink. So use that opportunity, find the best venue to build the confidence rather than shatter your confidence. That's the biggest thing. And avoid all the predatory outputs. That's the worst thing you could do in your first paper. Don't go to a predatory output, because you can't remove it from there. And we have clearly discussed, Professor Shaw talk about what could be the predatory outputs, and also language. It shouldn't be a problem. So start, be confident, have a network of people to rely on.
Thank you, Gajendran. And finally, Chatu, you've got the difficult job of adding anything new in now at the end, but any other
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I also have 3 points. All these 3 points have already been covered from our panelist. First thing is, I will reiterate them. So confidence and never give up. That's really important. And then finding a quality journal which matches the scope of your article to the scope of the journal, and then getting the help of the senior. These 3 things are, I think, really important for all of us, the early career researchers.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Chad. I think you've done my job for me, because you've summarized those contributions very nicely. So really just take this opportunity to thank you all for your contributions. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and we've kind of covered the whole kind of peer review process. So just really, if I can thank Professor Rajib Shaw, Professor Haigh Winarso, Associate Professor Tayaparan Gajendran, and Dr. Chatu Jayakodi. Thank you again for all of your contributions.
So Richard, can I say something?
Yes, of course, please.
Thank you. Actually, this morning I met my dean, the School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development of ITB, Professor Sri Mariati, and warm regards from her to Professor Richard and Professor Dilanti, and also for all the speakers. He very appreciate this program, and also hope that there will be a continuing collaboration between ITB and Huddersfield. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just for everybody's reference, is that Professor Boy Kombata?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that concludes the panel discussion. So thank you very much to our speakers. And if I can just ask our technical people to enable me to share my screen. That's better, yeah. Okay, so I hope everybody found the panel discussion useful. And I think it was a helpful way of summarizing a lot of the points that we've been discussing over the 2 days. And I know we picked up a few of the questions that have been raised in other sessions as well. So we've been through the publication journey. I think you've had a lot of advice in terms of both kind of the making those first steps and the importance of it in your career development, and being motivated, taking that initial leap into the writing process. I think it suggests a very, even if you're not comfortable in English, to make that journey even in your own language initially, with a view that then that could be developed further in the future. And of course, the importance of things like choosing journals that are reputable, making sure that you avoid predatory journals. We've also looked at, I think there was a very fruitful discussion yesterday around the different aspects of papers, and each of the sections, what might be considered good practice and what practices to avoid, which will be very helpful. So what we're going to be doing in the next few days, we're going to gather all of the materials together from the presenters, and we'll make them available on the project website. We will send you an email link in the coming days, probably early next week, once those materials have been uploaded, so that you can make reference to them, because I know there was a lot of useful guidance across the different speakers and within the individual sessions. We're also going to make a recording of the sessions available, so you can, if you want to revisit any of the discussions or individual speaker sessions, you'll be able to do that. So again, we'll make those links available to you next week. Now, before we sort of close, one of the other aspects of the workshop that we've offered is the opportunity to have a one-to-one publication surgery with a team of editors and peer reviewers. So what we thought is that it would be helpful, particularly for early career researchers who maybe haven't published before, haven't been through that journey before. Maybe they've got a research paper or idea, preferably in some form, so it shouldn't just be an idea with nothing written down. But if you've got the structure for a paper, or maybe some draft text for the paper, that's absolutely fine. But we're offering the opportunity for you to have a kind of one-to-one session with that group of experts, and it'll be done in a very constructive manner. So you don't need to be worried about, even if you're a bit worried that some of the work's not good enough, or the idea, it'll be very constructive and give you, the opportunity to improve that paper, and maybe some guidance on what level it's at, and whether it's at a level that might be appropriate for a journal publication, or what you may need to do to turn it into that. So what we're arranging, and this is in about 3 weeks' time, is the opportunity to arrange a one-to-one meeting with that sort of team of editors and reviewers to get constructive feedback on your draft abstracts or manuscripts. It'll be a bit like an interactive peer review process. So it aims to help you prepare and improve your manuscript and to maximize the opportunity for it to be accepted for publication. So one of the advantages is that you'll see the thought process that goes into why that feedback is being given, what aspects of the paper that maybe are good and bad and need improvement. And we'll also give you a written feedback on the paper as well. So it'll be in a form that mirrors the type of feedback that you get in a normal peer review process for the majority of international journals that they use when considering manuscripts for publication. So we'll look at issues like originality, the relationship to literature, methodology, results, the practicality and/or research implications, and the quality of communication. So again, with the email that we circulate next week, we will give you details of how you can take advantage of this opportunity, because it'll be on a kind of an appointment basis, but it'll be up to an hour with an opportunity to speak with that sort of panel of editors and reviewers. So if you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity, have a think in the coming days about whether you have a draft manuscript that's being prepared, or you've got an idea that you want to turn into. Maybe you can start structuring a paper that you would like to discuss with that panel. And then you can book for an appointment in late June, early July. So that's another opportunity, like a step on a kind of practical exercise after the workshop. So that brings to the end the main technical aspects of the workshop. Now I'd shortly like to hand over to my good colleague and friend, Dr. Haryo, who is going to just summarize bring to a close the event and thank all those people who've contributed over the last couple of days, and also in preparing for the event over the previous weeks. So thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Haryo.
Okay, thank you, Professor Richard, for this giving me opportunity. Good afternoon or good evening, as well as good afternoon for all the colleagues and participants, and also distinguished speakers and guests. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. That all, I believe that what we have done in these past 2 days is really fruitful. And it is my great pleasure to say that we had a very good discussion, also very best presentation in this workshop, and scientific writing and publication, which is especially for Indonesian researchers, that we learn a lot, not only knowing how to write technical writing in the proper manner, but also the strategy how to publish the technical writing. So my deep respect to all participants for your positive participation in the workshop. I know some of you are very seniors in researcher and also very prominent in Indonesia research, especially on the disaster risk reduction. And some of you also start as still in the beginning, but I know all of you are very care and have passion on the disaster itself. But having this opportunity, so this is very good also that for you to express your experience and your research into very good, valuable writing. I observed this, there are a lot of excellent presentation, and then various resource person, active discussion. And I think the most important is how we channel our research into the journal, as that we have in the last panelist discussion. Again, I stated in my opening remark, our role as Indonesian researchers are very crucial to play in the area of disaster risk reduction at the national, regional, and international. We thought having opportunity to express our research in the good manner of their technical writing, maybe nobody will understand what is our invention and what is our finding in those research. So I would like to thank you finally to my dear friends, Professor Richard and Professor Dilanti, for this opportunity to have this is very fruitful and very in-depth and appreciated workshop. And also I would like to express my sincere thank you to my best friend, Professor Bambang from Andalas University, and Professor Kombaitan, who is really support the works that we collaborate under Indonesia and UK collaboration. And also this is support for long journey of our research collaboration. Also, last but not least, I would like to say thank you to several organizations that have support for this, not only the workshop, but also the realization of this collaboration. First, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to UK Parliament Under Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and for UK Newton Fund, and then Government of Indonesia with former Ristek Brin, and also Emerald Publishing. And then there are several people that I would like to say a sincere gratitude here is the keynote address from Professor Susan Wilkinson Massey from Massey University, and also all the facilitators as well as rapporteurs who has conduct for the day one is from Huddersfield University and ITB, Miss Georgina Clegg, Miss Konsa Indana Sulfa, Mr. Asita De Silva, Miss Dewi Nur Hasana, Dr. Chaturanjani Jayakodi, and Mr. Ganesha Mangkusubroto, Miss Lilian Nuan Yi Sondesmart, and Dr. Faisal Imaduddin Wira Rohman, Ms. Safindri Naisanka, Ms. Devina Koirunisa. Also from the publisher, I would like to say thank you very much to Dr. Gemma Hemming from Emerald Publishing UK. And also last but not least, the 4 panelists for this last presentation, Professor Rajib Shaw from Keio University, Japan, Professor Haryo Winarso from Institute Technology Bandung, Professor Taya Paran Gajendra from University Newcastle, Australia, and Dr. Chaturanjani Jayakodi, University of Huddersfield. And also for handling the question and answer during this past today workshop, Mr. Asita De Silva, Ms. Georgina Clegg, Mr. Malik Seni Veranatne from University of Huddersfield. Also for the technical support, I would like to say thank you for Blink Production, and then for Mr. Marlon J. Sudasan, Ms. In Wahdini, Mr. Shane and whole Blink team, and for the artwork, Mr. Chamira Randil. And I would like also to special thank for Dr. Nuan Dias, University of Huddersfield, for organizing and coordinating the event. I would like to close this remark and officially announce on behalf of our team and our collaboration the end of the workshop, wishing for the future and good health, prosperity for all of us. Thank you very much. I return to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harkunti, and that's a wonderful way of summing up all of the contributions, and I think you realise how much effort has gone into the event from a whole range of people. All I can do is thank ITB for being fantastic partners in over many years, and also the University of Andalas as well, who've also joined us for this event and worked with us on several research projects in Indonesia. So really to close, just to wish you all of our participants the very best in their publishing journey. And I hope you found the event useful and it's given you the motivation and some guidance on how to take that next step into the publishing world or to strengthen your writing. So very best wishes, and I wish you a good evening in Indonesia and in other parts of Asia. And we're just approaching lunchtime here in the UK, so we have a bit more of the day to go. But yes, please do have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.